Hi, I'm Jeff Sikkenga, Executive Director of the Ashbrook Center, and this is The American Idea, where we discuss the ideas, people, and events that have made America what it is today. We believe that by understanding our history and our principles, we can better live up to the promise of the American founding and preserve our ongoing experiment in self-government. Welcome to The American Idea.
I want to welcome everyone to this episode of The American Idea. Today we're going to be talking about an issue that some people may have thought was history, but has come again to be important in our contemporary times, showing us that we do have lessons that we can learn from history that can be helpful for thinking through the issues that we face today. We're going to be talking about the Supreme Court and the idea of court packing. And for our conversation today, I'm joined by, I don't know, is he the oldest of old friends of mine? He's close, of mine, and also, of course, of the Ashbrook Center. You know him, you love him, John Moser, Chair of the Department of History and Political Science at Ashland University, Academic Chair of our Master of Arts in American History and Government program for teachers, and a wonderful teacher, scholar, and colleague. And John just now has a new book out entitled The Great Depression and New Deal, A Concise History. So we're going to be talking about court packing in the context of the Great Depression and New Deal, but maybe more broadly in American history. We have an expert with us. It's going to be a great conversation. John, thanks for joining us today.
It's wonderful to be here, Jeff. Thanks for that introduction.
The court packing scheme. When people hear about it, if they've heard of it, of course, they think of FDR.
No.
They think of the New Deal. They think of the Great Depression. They know, of course, a lot of our listeners are very historically literate, so they know quite a bit about it, but some folks might not be.
No.
Take us back to the 1930s and the situation that the United States faced and that FDR and the Supreme Court faced. What put FDR at odds with the Supreme Court?
Yeah. I think the first thing worth mentioning is the fact that we remember it as the court packing scheme suggests that this was not how FDR wanted it to be known. It was immediately called that. It put what he rightly concluded was the term of his critics. It's interesting how ordinarily it's the winners who get to name things, right? It's the Battle of Bull Run, right, as opposed to the Battle of Manassas, I guess, unless you're in Manassas. So FDR took the word liberal and took something that had never been considered liberalism before and redefined liberalism. More or less what we call liberal today is the legacy of FDR's New Deal, meaning it's very something different from something before. So FDR understood how important language was for things like this, but he wasn't able to get away from the term court packing. It was one of the biggest disasters of his presidency. Okay, so specifically in response to your question, it's 1937 is when this plan is unveiled. Starting in January 1935, the Supreme Court had issued a series of decisions, some of which were undercut significant chunks of the New Deal. So the New Deal had been going on since 1933. There was this huge wave of legislation in 33, a little bit less in 34. 35 is another big year for the New Deal. But while FDR is working with Congress to get through things like Social Security and the National Labor Relations Act and a number of other major legislative achievements, the Supreme Court is starting to whittle down what had been done so far. First of all, January 1935, the so-called the decision dealing with the so-called hot oil provision of the National Recovery Act. There were some that were very close, some decisions that ended up going in Roosevelt's favor, but they were very close decisions. The Supreme Court came one vote away from invalidating FDR's departure from the gold standard. which really would have been a massive blow. And then, of course, the huge one is in what was that, March of 1935, I think, the Schechter case, which invalidated the National Recovery Act, the National Industrial Recovery Act, I should say. The NIRA had been passed in 1933. It was supposed to be the centerpiece of FDR's whole strategy for overcoming the economic crisis of the Great Depression. And not only does the Supreme Court overturn it, but they do so unanimously. And the reason why he was having so much trouble with the court was the makeup of the court at the time. There were four very conservative justices who were often referred to as the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And then there were three others. And of course, these four were strict constructionists.
Right.
They were inclined to look at the stuff that was being passed starting in 1933 with a very jaundiced eye. They were determined to stop this. This is going farther than the Constitution would allow. Then you had another faction. Oh yeah, Ben Cardozo, Louis Brandeis, and Stone. Right, those three sometimes were called the Three Musketeers. They were practitioners of judicial restraint. They were willing to give the president and Congress the benefit of the doubt when it came to this stuff. And then there were two more who were wild cards. One of them being the Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes. Owen Roberts was the other. So all that the conservatives needed to overturn something was for one of the two wild cards to side with them, either Owen Roberts or Charles Evans Hughes. Often they got both. And as I mentioned already, on the Schechter case, which invalidated the National Industrial Recovery Act, they got all nine. Cardozo is a little more complicated. He wrote a concurrent decision that didn't agree with it entirely, but even he said this law shouldn't work the way it's proposed to work. So by the middle of 1935, FDR is livid at the Supreme Court. He feels particularly betrayed that guys like Brandeis and Stone
because I was going to say, right, that Louis Brandeis was a very famous progressive, and made his chops even as a progressive lawyer, arguing in favor of safety regulations, state-based wage minimum wage legislation, things like that. FDR must have been really shocked that someone like Brandeis or others on the court sided against him.
Yeah, Roosevelt referred to him as Old Elijah after the Old Testament prophet, and when he just couldn't believe it. I mean, he could believe it was overturned because he knew that the Four Horsemen were going to be hostile to everyone, and all they had to do is win over one person. But the fact that Brandeis went against it, fact is, he kind of misunderstood Brandeis. FDR sent some of his guys over to talk to Brandeis. What was going on here? And Brandeis had this great quote: "We're not going to let you guys centralize everything in Washington." Brandeis, it turned out, did not like the centralization of economic power. That's what made him a progressive to begin with, and somebody who wanted to check the growth of big business. On the other hand, he didn't like the centralization of political power either. So he was happy to sign on to a decision that said the National Industrial Recovery Act and the codes that were drawn up for all these industries represent an unconstitutional delegation of powers from the U.S. Congress to this government agency. And he said that's not going to fly.
So then you have that major decision. FDR's reaction then is obviously he's mad at the court. Does he immediately then start thinking, okay, I need to change who's on the court? Or does he start to take other avenues like, well, maybe let's go back to Congress and adjust these laws?
Yeah, he considers a range of options. It isn't really until his reelection that he starts to focus on this. So, by the way, one other big act, the overturning of the Agricultural Adjustment Act in the Butler case in 1936. It was not unanimous. It was a much narrower decision. But FDR is convinced by late in his first term that something has to be done. But after his crushing electoral victory in 1936, one of the biggest landslides in U.S. history, and the Democratic control of Congress just becomes absolutely overwhelming. I mean, obviously, it arguably had been overwhelming ever since 32. The Democratic majority increased in the 1934 midterms, increased even more in the 1936 elections. FDR is thinking at this point, now we can really go further, and he gives that sweeping second inaugural address where he says, "I see a third of a country ill-housed, ill-clothed, ill-fed," and he's promising major reforms. But the very first thing on his agenda in 1937 is dealing with the Supreme Court. And yeah, there were other ways he could have done it. He could have waited them out. On the other hand, it did not look like any of those four horsemen were going anywhere. He thought, well, if we can provide financial incentives, because they didn't have pensions originally. That was something that was developed in the 1930s.
So he's considering all these other options. How does he end up settling on what he settles on?
Yeah, I think part of it was he wanted to show how much authority he had now. Like with an unassailable majority in Congress, and he had never had a problem with Congress before. Congress gave him everything he wanted in his first term, and there was no reason for him to think that it would be that this was going to be anything different. So part of it, I think, was his disappointment at the fact that he had not been able to appoint a single Supreme Court justice. Right? Everybody on that court had been appointed by either Wilson, Harding, Coolidge, or Hoover. And this helps to explain why there was, and so many of the justices were inclined to oppose major parts of the New Deal. And I mean, maybe you pass a constitutional amendment to change the number. Well, who knows how long that's going to take to get a constitutional amendment through. In the meantime, it looks like there's a lot of danger ahead. There are cases making their way through the court system that were testing the constitutionality of Social Security and of the National Labor Relations Act. So FDR doesn't think he has time to spare on this. What's very interesting about how Roosevelt goes about this, though, is he kicks it to his Attorney General, Homer Cummings, and says, put together something. And the idea that gets hatched, and FDR obviously had some input in this too, but Cummings drafts the legislation. And what he comes up with, I'm just going to give the very quick summary of it. The most important part, and the part that most people objected to, was that for every member of the court that reached the age that had reached the age of 70, the president could name an additional justice up to a maximum of 15. There could be no more than 15 on the Supreme Court. So obviously there were 9 justices on the Supreme Court. 6 of them were at least 70 years of age. So if this legislation were to pass, FDR would immediately have the right to nominate 6 new justices to the Supreme Court, obviously completely changing the makeup of the court. And the argument, FDR used a number of arguments. One of these was that, and this is a classic progressive argument, the government should be like a cart being pulled by 3 horses. The American people are in the driver's seat. One of those horses is the presidency. One is Congress. The third is the Supreme Court. They should all be pulling in the same direction. Right? If they're not, if horses pulling a cart are going in different directions, the cart doesn't go anywhere. He says the problem is there's all this old blood on the court. They don't have the energy that younger men would have, so they're moving too slowly, and also they have old-fashioned ideas. They haven't kept up with the times. They have, and by the way, he very much included Brandeis in this category, saying that they had a horse and buggy interpretation of the Commerce Clause specifically. And so we have to bring the Supreme Court into the modern era by bringing in younger justices.
And I guess in this context, it's important, right, for many of our listeners would know this, but it's important for us to note that in Article 3 of the Constitution, it says that Supreme Court justices will have their tenure during good behavior, which is essentially lifetime, but it doesn't set the number of justices, right? And it doesn't say that you couldn't do something like this and add it. So it's not really a matter of this legislation going against the Constitution.
That's right. Yeah, there was nothing fundamentally unconstitutional about it. The problem was that for all his Roosevelt's concern for, these old gentlemen are tired and this is too much work for them, so we have to add some extra justices. Everybody understood why FDR was proposing this legislation, that he wanted to pack the Supreme Court. And this is why immediately it gets this name hung on it. And, packing the court does not sound savory. We don't remember it today as the Supreme Court reform of 1937, which is, it certainly, the bill was not called, it was called the Judicial Procedures Reform Act. It was not called the Court Packing Act. We entirely remember it today as court packing.
So when FDR comes up with this legislation, it's brought to him, it's written, as you say, by his attorney general, largely, he endorses it. How does he get it out to the public, and what's the immediate reaction?
So he calls together the leadership of Congress and simply announces, by the way, this is being presented before both houses, going before both houses today. And the congressional leadership were saying, excuse me? This was not how you do things. And it's not how FDR had done things up to this point. FDR had always worked closely with specific members of the House and Senate, sometimes even with Republicans, some of the more progressive Republicans. He had a very good working relationship with it, but he sprung this on them suddenly. Nobody in Congress had vetted it. He just said, here we go. So it really looked to members of Congress, even many longtime Democrats, as if this is someone who wants to be a dictator, right? And he is expecting us to,
Why is that? If he departed from his usual method, is it because he was flush with power after his reelection and he just thought, of course, everyone's going to go with it? Or was there some strategic reasoning behind that?
That's what's puzzling. And this gets to one of the most difficult things about FDR that has frustrated historians ever since, is it's really hard to tell what's really going on in FDR's mind. He left no diaries or memoirs. His letters to friends don't really go into detail on here's why I did this. He confided in very few people. So he's still in many ways a mystery to historians even this much later. So it seems reasonable to think that FDR believed I can do no wrong now. The American people have spoken and reelected by I think an unprecedented margin at this point. I think 64 was a wider one, but for this point, there had never been a more lopsided presidential election than 1936, and that Congress had always done what he wanted before. So here we go. And he springs it on them, and they're not happy. There's something else going on here too. FDR had assumed the support of a couple of major blocs in the legislature. One of them were Southern Democrats. The other were progressive Republicans. Southern Democrats had started to sour. I mean, they loved like Tennessee Valley Authority. They loved New Deal programs that directed money to the South. They weren't sure about certain other ones. And progressive Republicans were, like Brandeis, concerned about centralization of power. And look, everybody knew the Republicans were, the conservative Republicans were going to oppose the plan, but they didn't matter. There's something like a third of the US Senate at this point. So on their own, they can't stop it. But Southern Democrats joining in, as well as the progressive Republicans who had almost always sided with New Deal legislation, came out in opposition. Burton K. Wheeler, I guess he's neither a progressive Republican nor a Southern Democrat. He was a Democrat from the state of Washington. Burton Wheeler had been the first guy to talk up FDR as president back in 1931. He had been regarded as a Roosevelt loyalist up to this point. He said, absolutely not. In fact, he took the lead in fighting against it on the Senate floor, and he would end up being one of FDR's biggest enemies over this and other things, like over Lend-Lease in 1941. Burton Wheeler was a mortal and became a mortal enemy of FDR, but it was really the court packing that turned it. The idea is FDR wants to be a dictator, is what the arguments are being. Carter Glass, Democrat from Virginia, makes this argument as well. And okay, we look back on it today and think this is kind of overwrought. But in the context of the time, right, the democracy, the status of democracy around the world seemed to be very much in danger.
Yeah, right. We kind of forget the 1930s, as you've written in other books. The 1930s were sort of the decade of fascism.
Yeah, there were plenty of people who admiringly looked toward Mussolini's Italy or Stalin's Soviet Union, and said, these regimes are showing us the way of the future. Democracy is outdated with all of its its processes are too slow to address modern problems. There's corruption, et cetera, et cetera. So the health of global democracy in 1936 does not look all that great. And this I think causes many members of Congress to say, what's FDR really up to? He's won this crushing victory. His party dominates Congress. Now he's going to try to get control of the Supreme Court. We can't allow that to happen.
So when people like Wheeler or Glass come out against the legislation, what's FDR's reaction? Does he back off? Does he say, okay, let's talk about this. We can, we'll work through this. We can modify things. Or does he double?
He goes on the air and he delivers one of his famous fireside chats, because this was FDR's go-to. He would go directly to the American people and lay the case before them. And it was in the context of this fireside chat that he gave his analogy of the three-horse cart. And it didn't have the same magic this time. Something like Gallup poll showed that a third of those who had voted for Roosevelt in 1936 opposed the Judicial Reform Act. A bunch of newspapers that had endorsed FDR in 1936 came out against this. So there is trouble on the horizon. And then there are hearings that are called, right? Homer Cummings testifies eloquently in favor of it, but then this letter gets delivered. It was written by Hughes, but Brandeis and Devanter, I think it was the three oldest members of the Supreme Court, signed this letter saying, thanks for your concern, but we're fine with the workload. We are not overwhelmed by it. In fact, if you add more justices, that's just going to slow things down more, because it's more people that have to be convinced. And that was one of the nails in the coffin. But what ultimately, I think, derailed the whole project is something that the Supreme Court did. This was in March. I mean, while this is all going on, the Supreme Court rules in West Coast Hotel v. Parrish that a state law that had been passed establishing minimum wages was constitutional.
Whereas before they had struck down state minimum wage laws.
6 months earlier, yeah. By a 5-4 margin, it was upheld in West Coast Hotel. 6 months earlier, a very similar case had come up, and it went 5-4, invalidating it. The swing vote was Owen Roberts. Owen Roberts, in autumn of 1936, had ruled that the states could not have minimum wage laws. 6 months later, he rules that they can. And to this day, we are not sure why he did this. But this got hailed in a phrase that soon caught on as the switch in time that saved 9. The argument being that Roberts was frightened by this Judicial Reform Act. And he said, oh, I better change my mind on this. And if I switch my position on this, it will undercut this act. But if I don't, we're going to be looking at trouble. There's a problem with that argument. Roberts had gone on record as early as December of 1936. December 1936, before this law had been unveiled, and saying that he had kind of changed his mind on this topic. It has been speculated, and I think it's a reasonable argument, that the real reason for his switch was not the Judicial Reform Act, but rather the crushing re-election of Roosevelt. It became clear, look, we're stuck with him. We're stuck with him. Eventually, people are going to retire, and sure enough, soon the Four Horsemen started retiring. So we're going to stop. We're going to stop fighting. And FDR never had a major problem with the Supreme Court again after this. In fact, before Roosevelt died in April 1945, he had picked 8 Supreme Court justices.
Wow. Yeah.
Exactly as many as George Washington had. So
it's amazing.
Zero in his first term, but once the ice flow started to break away, it was soon an avalanche.
Before we continue with our conversation, I think it's important to take a moment and tell you about our undergraduate honors program in the liberal arts here at Ashland University.
Hi, I'm Rich Police, Associate Director of Student Programs at the Ashbrook Center. The Ashbrook Scholar Program is an honors program located at Ashland University for undergraduate students with an interest in politics, history, and economics. Modeled after a classical liberal education, you will read the great texts, not textbooks. Your classes will be conversations, not lectures. Conversations with other students, with your professors, and with great thinkers and statesmen from throughout human history. If you or a young person you know are passionate about life's important questions, if you want an education that emphasizes discovery, if you value liberal education and the principles of freedom it upholds, then this is the place for you. To learn more, visit us online at ashbrookscholar.org.
Yeah, that's right. Because I'm thinking of that same time as West Coast Hotel, there's another decision, NLRB versus Jones and Laughlin Steel Company, right, where the Supreme Court allows a more expansive reading of Congress's Commerce Clause, upholding the Wagner Act. So those two decisions do kind of take the steam out of it. And then, of course, as you say, over the course of the rest of his term, FDR appoints all of these justices, so that by the time you get to even 1942, our listeners might know the case of Wickard versus Filburn, right? This is upholding the Agricultural Adjustment Act in all of its comprehensive regulation. I think it's unanimous, that decision. So much has changed. When these hearings happen, but when the Supreme Court does the switch in time, it saves 9, but only in hindsight. We know that now. Right. What was FDR's reaction to the hostility? So the political forces are hostile. The public doesn't seem to be with him. The Supreme Court has changed its mind. Does he just drop the scheme?
It actually goes to a vote One of the things that also works against FDR is that the Majority Leader Joseph Robinson of Arkansas had been a real stalwart supporter of FDR. During these debates, he has a heart attack and dies, and so a crucial ally is lost in the course of this. It ended up going down by a significant margin, and it is FDR's first major setback as president. And even though it didn't, as we've already established, the Supreme Court ends up going his way almost immediately after it, even without this happening. But his relationship with Congress is never fully restored.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. What's the effect of this on the rest of the course of the New Deal and the Roosevelt administration?
I think in a sense, the antennae are up on the part of members of Congress that Southern Democrats are certainly more willing to oppose FDR afterward. For instance, in 1938, FDR proposes an Executive Reorganization Act, which really was pretty innocuous. But Southern Democrats seized on this as the FDR is trying to centralize more power within the executive branch. This is incipient dictatorship going on, and FDR is amazed by this. I mean, in a way, he kind of understood why there was resistance to the Judicial Reform Act. But this executive bill, he says, there's nothing in here that would suggest I'm becoming a dictator. Doesn't matter. Some of FDR's longtime supporters vote against him on this, and the Executive Reorganization Act goes down to defeat. So yeah, he's lost a good chunk. It's not as though the New Deal's done. There are a number of things though that start to accumulate. The recession of 1937. Southerners start working with conservative Republicans. The so-called purge of 1938, when Roosevelt decides that, well, I'm going to go after members of my own party who have let me down. So his administration targets about a half dozen members of the House and Senate, and FDR endorses their primary opponents. And this is a disastrous strategy. It doesn't work out FDR's way at all. All but one of the members of Congress that he targeted managed to be reelected in 1938, and they're not going to be friends. Certainly not going to be friendly to FDR after this. So, and in 1938, the Republicans make major gains in both houses, so that increasingly Republicans and conservative Democrats can work together to stop major pieces of New Deal legislation. So the New Deal kind of peters out by 1939.
Is it too much to say that the court packing scheme was the cause or one of the causes of the New Deal losing steam?
Yeah, it's not it is, and it's hard to say. The recession is a big deal as well, because that takes a lot of the wind out of the sails of the New Deal. Hey, they're supposed to have brought about economic recovery. What's going on? But it's a tremendous blow. And as I've said, the relationship, the very cozy relationship between the White House and the Capitol that had developed during FDR's first term never fully recovers. It's not to say FDR can't get anything done. There's still some pretty important pieces of New Deal legislation that get passed in 1937 and 1938, but you don't see anything like the flood of New Deal legislation that you saw in 33, 34, 35.
So historical insights from this, John, it strikes me that one of the things is, as we said before, the number of Supreme Court justices is not set in the Constitution. Congress sets that by law. Obviously, it can change that by law, but it hasn't been changed. It wasn't changed before the 1930s. It has not been changed since the 1930s. Yeah. And when the Supreme Court made some decisions in the last few years, especially the Biden administration opposed, they floated this idea, and it seemed to have been met with, I don't want to say universal hostility or suspicion, but very wide hostility and suspicion, even by people who would be supporters of President Biden.
Yeah. Yeah, and we see great disappointment on the left wing of the Democratic Party that this hasn't been done. I think a lot of this has to do with the lessons of 1937, but it's also clear that I haven't seen any written idea of this. I haven't seen potential legislation providing for this. But my understanding is when people talk about adding justices to the Supreme Court, they're not talking about doing it the way FDR did, saying, well, once they reach for each one who's above a certain age, there would be no pretense that this would be done for any other reason. Again, nobody believed FDR either, but this would not even have a hint of pretense about this being anything but putting as many people as we want to change the majority on the court. And I think that would appear, my mind keeps going to the word shameless. I don't know if it's the best word, but it would appear so openly partisan that I think a lot of more moderate Democrats were held back on that. Yeah. And I think that's the case with Biden as well. On the other hand, if it went forward, probably Democrats would line up and do it. They would line up and support it, right? You wouldn't have the partisan divide is so much harder today than it was in 1937. You could bet that the Democrats, with maybe one or two defections, would vote for it, and every Republican would vote against it. It would be interpreted as an entirely partisan thing, because it would be a totally partisan thing. And I think this is the biggest argument that's used. What happens if the Republicans retake it? They retake the White House and Congress.
Right.
They'll just
it's going to be an
arms race.
Expand the Supreme Court.
Yeah, we'll just keep adding every new president who has a friendly Congress is going to just add as many justices as necessary. So this would, at least there was some kind of limit set to the 1937 Act of 15 would have been a huge expansion. I think, yeah, this would end up just becoming a partisan arms race now.
And it is interesting to me that it really does show you the fundamental importance of the idea in the mind of Americans back in the 1930s and still continuing today. And maybe this moment in American history really cemented this idea of judicial independence, that the Supreme Court is not supposed to be a partisan body, even though everybody knows justices have leanings, but it's not supposed to. It's supposed to be impartial. It's supposed to be judicial in its temperament, not political, and supposed to be independent of Congress and of the executive branch, and not an instrument, as people thought in the 1930s, and not an instrument of the president.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah, that idea seems to have that moment in American history really seems to have cemented that deeply in American public life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's definitely the case. If Americans looked at what FDR trying to do and they said, well, this is what dictators do. Was FDR trying to become a dictator? No, I don't think so. But I understand why people thought that was the case.
If our listeners want to, besides read your terrific narrative history on the Great Depression and New Deal, A Concise History, if our listeners want to explore this really interesting moment in American history more fully, what resources do you recommend for them?
There were a couple of books on this subject. The classic is by James McGregor Burns. Burns has written one of the most famous biographies of FDR. It's simply called Packing the Court: The Rise of Judicial Power and the Coming Crisis of the Supreme Court. There's another more recent one called FDR's Gambit: The Court Packing Fight and the Rise of Legal Liberalism, and that's by Laura Kalman. I am less familiar with that, but I have heard it mentioned, and it's a well-regarded work.
I think I would add to that Jeff Sheshol, who was a speechwriter for Bill Clinton. I think it's Shesol, wrote a book called Supreme Power, which is really good in catching the drama of the moment. Okay, John, you mentioned before FDR's reaction to this, and the fact that he was surprised that people were opposed to this, and then he kept pushing it thought he could go to the American people in a fireside chat in 1937 and kind of overwhelm Congress with public opinion. Is that typical of FDR's temperament? It's very interesting to me how savvy politically he was, and how, as you mentioned, no one could quite read him. He didn't reveal himself. He's not a Teddy Roosevelt sort of person, right? He's very savvy, very self-controlled. Does this incident reveal something about FDR, the person?
I think he believes that he is the genuine voice of the people. He is in fact, I believe it's in 1936, 1937 that we first hear about the idea that the president has a mandate to go out and do stuff. So FDR has a mandate to continue the New Deal. What stands in the way of continuing the New Deal? What perhaps even jeopardizes what has already been accomplished under the New Deal? Well, it's the Supreme Court. So this is an impediment that has to be removed or reformed. So I do think and the fact that he chooses to fight back by going before the American people on the fireside chat, right? The fireside chats were wonderfully effective media for communications. He got the message of his administration out in a way that no previous president had done, because FDR knew how to use radio like no previous president. Of course, radio hadn't even been around all that long. But it just, this time it kind of fell flat. And he would use, it's not like fireside chats stopped being a thing. He would continue to give important fireside chats, some of which his Arsenal Democracy speech is the classic example, were just as effective as some of his earlier ones. Why the American people don't go along with this one? Maybe they don't see it as relevant as, say, the bank crisis. The banks are closed. What's going to happen now? Right. Or what's going on in Europe? This seems a little bit more abstruse to the American public, perhaps. Or as you say, this longstanding notion that the judiciary is supposed to be independent. Who wants a dependent judiciary? Well, that's what kings do. George III wanted it. Had judges that were dependent. It's what dictators in Europe did. So I think I think it's FDR going to the well of public opinion and finding it in this instance dry.
What do we know about the individual justices' response to FDR's idea? You mentioned the letter that was written by the three oldest justices. But did the justices take this personally as an attack on them?
Definitely, yeah. I mean, Brandeis was the oldest member. So when he hears FDR say, "Well, these elderly men, they have a horse and buggy approach, and they're not in tune with the times, and they're growing slow and feeble in their old age," Brandeis took extreme exception to that. So in a way, I mean, it's not like they became personal enemies, but and as I said before, Brandeis had always had some concerns about some elements of the New Deal. I think that this is points to the extent to which the New Deal is simply a logical extension of Wilsonian era progressivism. You hear that often. And FDR personally looked upon Wilson as a hero, but a lot of those old progressives who were still around, a lot of them said, "This is different. This is not what Wilson that Wilson would. It's not something Wilson would have approved of if he were still around." The kind of the centralization of political authority. The bureaucratization, the trying to create a dependent court. This isn't progressive. So it's not just rock ribbed conservatives who are who have a problem with some of what FDR is doing.
Fascinating. I wonder if other people in the FDR administration, do we have any record of their views on what their boss was doing? Were they full-throated supporters of this, or did they privately think, "What in the world is our boss doing?"
Yeah, well, there were a lot of them who were upset that they hadn't been consulted. I mean, they learned about it when FDR unleashed it on Congress. This was Homer Cummings in his office coming up with this and bringing it to FDR. So John Nance Garner, the vice president, said, I don't support this. So
really,
Garner spent a good chunk of FDR's second term trying to set himself up to be the party's nominee in 1940, and he made no secret of the fact that he wanted to take the country and the party in a more conservative direction. So this was his opportunity, really, to show that he was not FDR's man.
Well, if your own vice president and members of your administration and the key players in Congress are opposing it, I guess it's not a surprise that it met the fate that it did.
Yeah.
You know, John, puzzling to me, it seems like this would be a great movie. There's a lot of drama in this, more drama than you usually associate with the Supreme Court. But I don't think a movie's ever been made of this.
No, I don't. Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, Joe Robinson keeling over at the podium, and I think that's right.
Let me ask you one last question. As a student, you're obviously a profound student of this era in American history. What to you about this episode is the most surprising?
Yeah, I think it's the extent to which individuals in the House and Senate who had never gone on record as opposing any aspect of the New Deal were willing to jump ship on this. This was very much a bridge too far. So it really did show in a way that if you understand the party system in the 1930s, maybe it's less surprising. But certainly to people who look at the parties today, they would probably find surprising the extent to which members of the president's own party would become very hostile to this, and as well as the major divisions within the Republican Party. Progressive Republicans had stood by the New Deal loyally, so there was but this helped to bring the two wings of the party back together.
Oh, that's a fascinating, really great conversation, John. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us for a conversation about a time really that is past but not past us in so many ways. John Moser, thanks for taking the time to join us today on The American Idea.
Pleasure to be here, Jeff. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The American Idea. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe at Apple Podcast, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts, and leave a 5-star review. If you want to learn more or get involved in Ashbrook's vital work, visit our website, ashbrook.org.